Thank you, Bernice. I'm a mindfulness-based psychotherapist, and the material I'm going to share with you tonight is material that is very close to my heart. I've spent many, many years working with these ideas, and I'm going to try to give you a concentrated, short journey with those ideas. Here we go. Let's try this. Okay. So in working with failure, I find it helpful to think about it like looking through a kaleidoscope, right? It's constantly shifting. And I think it shifts because where you are with yourself and where you are in your life is always moving. Now, there are objective failures, but tonight we're going to focus on what I call subjective failures, because there's a spectrum with subjective failures. It depends on how you define it. Some of us feel like we're struggling with career or money, others with family or parenting or looking for love. We're struggling to find love. It just looks different for everyone. But the paradox is we need failure, right? It's how we survive, it's how we evolve, it's how we learn, it's how we adapt. And yet, why are so many of us almost hardwired to resist working with failure? What happens when we resist working with failure is that we get stuck. Now, the truth is there's no easy way out of working with failure. There's no bypass or 6 easy steps so you never have to deal with it. The truth is it's a process, and it's in the struggle that we find resilience. I like this Robert Frost quote, "The only way out is through." So in this talk, we're going to go into a little bit about the physiological and psychosocial stressors that are part of the resistance we encounter when we're trying to work through failures. And then I'm going to bring in some insights and some beautiful practices, some strategies to help us deepen the conversation around it. Okay. Anyone ever hear of an amygdala? We all have one. It is the part of your brain where your fight or flight response happens. And when it detects a stressor or a perceived threat, it fires. And that's how we know whether we move into fight or flight. Now, you could get triggered on the 405, or you could get triggered when you're in a big fight with your partner. Your amygdala isn't really making subtle distinctions. And so when you think about something like failure, right, it feels so broad, so opaque. What does that mean? You know, is there something to do? Run for the hills? You jump in and beat it up? It's not. It's complex. But it's very stressful. And so we have, many of us, an avoidance to wanting to confront our failures. So avoidant behavior looks like anxiety, depression, maybe compulsive behaviors. Maybe we binge eat or binge watch Netflix. We don't want to deal with failures because they're so difficult. Right? There's a lot of negative emotions and thoughts that attend the feeling of failure. Now, when we go into fight or flight, this is the primitive part of our brain being activated. When we get emotionally triggered, we cut off our rational minds. We don't have access to, right, our higher functioning, our curiosity, our insight, our compassion, right? We're sort of coming from this place right here. And why that's problematic is because we need the higher functioning in order to work through failures that are complex and subtle. There we have our amygdala. All right, our negativity bias. So if your amygdala detects stressors, your negativity bias remembers them. So let's say half the village died off last year from eating poison red berries. Your negativity bias is going to make sure you have an aversion for red berries for the rest of time. But let's say you went on a terrible Tinder date. Your negativity bias is not going to operate in the same way, right? Maybe it'll start to spin a web, a narrative, how you're feeling jaded and cynical and sarcastic, and maybe even fatalistic about ever finding love. So on one level, your negativity bias is protecting you, but it's not helping you solve the question, right? It's not going to get you closer to finding connection or intimacy. So you can see that our amygdala and our negativity bias, they function more like hammers than scalpels. And you need more subtlety when you're dealing with complex problems. So now we're going to move into the psychosocial piece, social stigma around failure. Now, some of the stigma around failure is self-generated, but a lot of it is really in the culture. We get the message that it's not okay to fail, right? And this triggers our social anxiety because we want to belong to the pack. We want to feel like we're connected, right? What happens is when we feel shame around failing, we don't want to experience the rejection or the humiliation or the embarrassment, and that triggers our fight or flight too. This is another important one, permission to fail. I don't know how many of you are parents or teachers, but as a parent, you give your kid endless permission to fail, whether they're learning to walk or talk or use utensils or social media. But when we become adults, it's like a wall comes down. Somehow we retract that permission to fail. Even the term permission to fail, right, is kind of suspect. How about permission to learn? We get messages from the society, cultural messages that say, hey, you can just do it. All you need is perseverance and tenacity, and you just need to believe in yourself, and you can just do it. But the truth is, you can't just do it, right? You don't have confidence right out at the gate. You develop confidence. You acquire confidence as you move through your experience. So I always say it's okay to do it later, but not to procrastinate. But it's really kind of interesting, right? That this is more outcome-based versus process-based. And I think when we're working with failures, we have to really think about, how do I move in to that place where I can do it, where I can muster the courage? And then this one here, frustrated expectations, I think is really at the core of why we suffer so much when we experience a failure, right? Many of us have a fantasy, let's say, that we want the world to work out on our terms, right? We get attached to a particular outcome or a particular thing, and we get devastated when it doesn't happen. And instead of accepting the disappointment and accepting the loss, we fixate on it, right? And that causes us a great deal of suffering. So I think when you're looking at sort of the complexity of all these factors here, it's really not easy to work with your resistance. And I would say in my personal life and in my clinical work, what I've come to understand is you cannot metabolize the lessons of failure. You cannot get the meaning out of your experience until you have a way of containing all the negative emotional thoughts and feelings that come up, and they can come up in any different variety, right? Working through failure is such a specific, such an individual journey, and I think that's why methods don't apply, right? There's no universal plan to work through failures. This is the part of my speech where my 12-year-old son rolls his eyeballs. Some of you know him. He says it's really boring, but I disagree. Meditation and mindfulness practice. Meditation has been around for eons, and the West has recently embraced it in its secularized form. But meditation and mindfulness practice do just that, right? They can contain your anxious mind, but they can also downregulate your triggered nervous system. And you really need both kinds of containment. So meditation is the process of sitting, anchoring in the breath, allowing for your thoughts and feelings and sensations to arise without judging your experience, just observing and coming back to the breath again and again. And it's this process, right, that downregulates you from your sympathetic nervous system, arousal, high alert, to your parasympathetic nervous, base, calm. I like this image here. It's an aquarium. I'm not sure if it's a shark or a whale, but I think meditation and mindfulness practice allow you some distance, right? You turn the volume down on those negative thoughts and feelings, and they give you perspective. Now, mindfulness practice is a sister practice, a complementary practice to meditation, and it is the skill of being in the present moment with intention, creating self-awareness, allowing for those same thoughts and feelings to arise, but not getting attached, not over-identifying with those feelings. And when we get to that place where we can quiet our anxious mind, we can get into the real deep questions. We can get into the true nature of resistance. This is when we haven't started meditating. And this is where your inner wisdom personified might look. The deep questions. What is the nature of the resistance you're confronting? And I think it's two things. It's either one, what is the limit that I must accept, right? What is that frustrated expectation that I must reconcile with? Maybe I wanted that job so badly and I didn't get it, or that person I fell in love with chose somebody else, right? How can I accept the loss and grieve the loss so that I can move on? Now, if the next question is, you're at a threshold where you must cross, then the question is, how do I take responsibility for myself? How do I take responsibility for that desire, for that instinct to move forward? Acceptance and responsibility, right? It's a threshold. So now we're really understanding how failures are the doorways, the initiations really into the deepest kinds of questions, right? Not only do they build resilience, this idea of acceptance and responsibility is absolutely critical to adult development. And we get to see our life not from the framework of being a victim, but choosing, embracing our fate, changing our fate, creating our destiny, because we have a really clear sense of what we need to do. So as I wrap up this talk, and I know everybody does that, I do want to put a challenge to you guys, which is to think about, right, what issue do I have that feels really unresolved, that I've been cruel and judgmental and uncompassionate around? Could I take some of these ideas, compassion, curiosity, and mindfulness, and can I change the conversation? Because the only way out is through. Thank you.